So I say they have bourbon on tap. Something to look forward to. Is this stuff that's been in the paper that you're going to be talking about?
Sorry?
This stuff that's been in the paper? Okay.
So how do you start just security? Do you all see each other as competitors or collaborators? I ran an NGO, I understand.
Areas.
The number of young people, you must know with your students, the number of young people who are interested in this set of topics is so much bigger.
Welcome to tonight's event, National Security, the Midterms, and the 114th Congress. I'm Ryan Goodman. I'm a professor of international law and political science at New York University, and tonight I'm here primarily in my capacity as co-editor-in-chief of the Just Security blog. I wanted to personally welcome everybody and also welcome you on behalf of my co-editor-in-chief, Steve Vladeck, who's on tonight's panel, and also to welcome you on behalf of our friends at CQ Roll Call, who are the co-sponsors and co-organizers of tonight's event, and without whom tonight's event wouldn't be possible. It's also terrific to partner with them on this particular occasion, which is our first year anniversary of the blog. And we've had an extraordinary year. I want to keep my opening remarks quite short, but just to mention that Steve and I are extraordinarily grateful to our board of editors, who are composed of former senior lawyers in the U.S. government, leading scholars and civil rights attorneys. Some of the highlights of our past year have included blog posts being entered into the Congressional Record, our members briefing members of Congress on the basis of their posts, recognition by the New York Times public editor for our critique of the New York Times' coverage of drone strikes, and one of our posts affecting how female experts are selected at UN arms control meetings. We also thought to just use this occasion to announce 4 new board members, and they are Kristen Eichenser, visiting professor at UCLA and formerly of the State Department's Legal Advisor's Office, Rolf Mowat-Larsen, senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and former CIA's chief of the European Division, Faiza Patel, co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center, and finally Michael Schmidt, chair of the International Law Department at the Naval War College. So the vision for Just Security is to broaden and raise the level of conversation about U.S. national security issues. Our ideals are to engage and interrogate issues of the day from multiple perspectives. So for example, if you go to the blog now or today, you'll see a list of dozens of debates that we've held over the year, highlighting different perspectives and different ideas coming from competing viewpoints. And that's, in some sense, a great segue into tonight's event. So tonight we have an extraordinary group of experts on national politics and national security, moderated by David Ellis, Vice President of News at CQ Roll Call. And with that, I wanted to thank David personally and thank CQ Roll Call for tonight. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan, and it's my pleasure to be here. And let's introduce this distinguished panel straight away. From the audience's far left, a gentleman who's probably never been described as far left before, Cully Stimson of the Heritage Foundation. He is a senior legal fellow there and former Deputy Assistant Secretary for detainees at the Defense Department. Next to him is Rachel Kleinfeld. She's the Senior Associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. where she specializes in issues related to fragile states and post-conflict nations. She not only comments on foreign policy, but she helped shape it by serving as former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's one of her advisors on the Foreign Affairs Policy Board. Next to her is Steve Lodek, who is Professor of Law at the American University Washington College of Law and co-editor-in-chief of Just Security. And that online forum, as you could see from the amount of recognition, has become sort of the go-to place for vigorous debate on foreign policy. To my left is Jerry Seib, who's the Washington bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires, the leading interpreter of the NBC News Journal poll, and writer of Capital Journal, one of the few must-read columns here in this town. And then on the end is my colleague, Tim Starks, who is a defense specialist and writes the 5x5 blog for CQ Roll Call. Look it up, Google that phrase. And he has a long history. Previously, he covered intelligence for CQ Roll Call. So he has a lot to contribute along with my panel. So thank you for coming and joining us on the last summer evening of the year. Let me start with Jerry Seib. Last week, you wrote, "Fear is back," and how it may influence the upcoming election. Now, when we put this panel together, I think we would have said there was probably no role in national security. That's changed a bit. I think there's a panel consensus that it won't play a big role. But can you describe what you're seeing in the polling and whether or not there's enough percolation period, 6 weeks before the election, for it to have an impact on the vote itself?
Sure. Well, thanks, and thank you all for being here. I sort of look at what happened over the year as a sort of an arc that goes this way, that the country and the Obama administration are sort of bumping along with the president kind of in sync with American public opinion, I think, on the question of the summer, which was, do we want to get involved in Syria and Iraq? And his answer was no, and the American people's answer was no, though they weren't exactly rewarding him for being in sync with them. They were in some ways punishing him for doing exactly what they wanted him to do. That's a different conversation. But that's, I think, where things were until one thing happened. The one thing that happened was that there was a release of the beheading video of James Foley. And what we found in our polling is that event grabbed the attention of the American public. There was more attention paid to that event in terms of the way people responded to questions, asking what people are paying attention to than any event we've tested for the last 5 years. More than Trayvon Martin, more than the Obamacare rollout, you name it. There was more people paid attention to the beheading videos than anything we've tested for the last 5 years. So it was a galvanizing moment, and it changed attitudes. And so when we asked, should the U.S. be militarily involved against the Islamic State a couple of weeks ago, the answer was 61% of the people said yes. Slightly higher among Republicans than among Democrats and independents, but across the board there was a sense we got to do something. Now, the caveat there is I don't think, I think there's still limited appetite. And when we ask people, do you want to be more involved or less involved in world affairs, that number that the U.S. should be more involved in world affairs had ticked up since the spring, but not a lot. And I think the reason I think we've all said amongst ourselves as we talked about this, that I don't believe this question of what's the U.S. role in the Middle East, what's the proper strategy against the Islamic State Army is going to be a huge midterm election is because I think both parties are deeply divided on this. If you look at the vote in the House last week on authorizing training of Syrian rebels, for example, if conservatives split amongst themselves, liberals split amongst themselves, House leaders all for it, but some members of the leadership against it, the Black Caucus was split. There's not a party position for the Democrats or the Republicans. It makes it very hard for parties to gain traction on an issue like that.
Certainly, and there's also the political powder keg of involvement. Rachel, you mentioned that national security, it's possibly a good thing that it isn't a big part of debate in midterm elections. Explain why.
Well, I would love for national security to play a bigger role in general because I think we're a democracy. The American people should have a say. But our Congress is not now organized for the American people to have a say. It's highly gerrymandered. So districts are going to people who are of the party that has gerrymandered that district, and that's pushing districts to the fringes. And the way that the votes are being jerry-rigged is similar. So you get a Veterans Affairs vote with an Iran sanctions vote stuck onto it. or a pull out of Iraq vote, or pull troops out of Iraq vote with a Iraq funding vote stuck together. And these are gotcha votes. The whole reason that these votes are being structured is so that an attack ad can be written later for whoever votes for or against the vote to get them in the midterms because of that kind of gerrymandering of the districts. As long as we have a Congress in which you know that if you vote on a serious national security issue, there's going to be attack ads at the midterms and you're going to be hurt in the polls, you're not going to get serious thinking and serious debate. And that's where we are right now. So the politics of this issue suggests to me that we need to pull back on how politicized it is until we can change this politics. And I think we have, 8 more years until the census happens again?
Right. And, well, but that debate can't wait 8 years. And as your colleague, Dave Cole, in Just Security this day pointed out, the move against the Islamic State, and I guess for the purpose of this conversation we'll call it that, is using an authorization for an old war that the president declared over for a new war. So, Steve, Congress needs to act, and the president seems to agree on that. When are we going to get that debate?
Well, I think before Congress can act, Congress has to be here. And we were talking backstage before about how this Congress has had, the House has had 12 legislative days, this year, which that sounds like the law professor's workload. I think Congress isn't really planning to come back until after the midterms, and so I think the rest of the conversation about what should Congress do before the midterms is now moot. But I think that's putting the president in a very awkward spot. So on the one hand, I think President Obama is deeply committed to a inter-branch process, to some kind of meaningful dialogue with Congress. But Congress isn't there, literally. And so the question becomes, as things on the ground develop in Iraq and Syria in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I think the president's going to feel increasing pressure to go it alone, simply because as a matter of logistics, he has to go it alone.
Right.
And so I think the real question becomes, what happens after the midterms? Is the president going to work with Congress on some kind of new AUMF? There's a lot of support in at least circles among the moderate sides of both parties for Senator Tim Kaine's proposal for a new AUMF. We haven't heard the White House formally endorse it yet or step away from it, but I think Congress has to confront that. I think it's going to be one of the first things on their agenda when they get back after the election.
Right. Colleague, does the president have enough authority to act right now?
I think he does. But to Jerry's earlier point, the beheadings, before the beheadings, the American people, I looked at the major polling, the Pew USA Today polling, the major study that came out May 5th. 48% of people when polled said the economy and unemployment was their top concern, followed healthcare at 42%, the budget deficit at 38%, education at 31%, national security down at 19%, and immigration was at 14% below that. But the beheadings were a forcing mechanism. And what happened was, because Congress planned to be in session only 12 legislative days after the summer recess, the beheadings compressed the calendar in terms of what the president could do and what Congress really wanted to do. And what Congress really wanted to do was pass a short time extension to the budget and then get out of town and focus on the elections. But I would take a little bit difference with Rachel's point. I don't think that Congress is political is a new concept, that Congress doesn't want to take tough votes is a new concept, that districts are more gerrymandered than ever, and I agree with you, and that's, I think, an unhealthy thing. But if you read back during Lincoln's time, 1862, 1863, they avoided votes because it was too politically difficult then, and it hasn't changed since.
Before we go any further, we'll have to have a debate about who we're actually fighting. And even an informed citizen might be very confused without a scorecard on who actually are the threats. So I'd like to bring Tim Starks in here. No sooner had the president finished speaking about Islamic State action than you had Clapper and the intelligence community briefing lawmakers about what they considered more dangerous threats, more pressing threats to the United States. So could you walk us through those?
Sure, and you're right. It's very difficult for the average person to keep track of these groups. It's difficult for the intelligence community to keep track of these groups. And they morph very quickly, or they're capable of morphing quickly away from public view. Maybe it's a little slower process. People might forget that Al-Qaeda in Iraq is sort of a forebearer of Islamic State group that has become such a big threat now. So, for instance, the Bipartisan Policy Center is going to be releasing a report tomorrow that says it actually does sort of have a chart of where all these groups are. They say that looking at 2008 compared to now, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates are operating in 16 different countries, which is about double what it was in 2008. And that doesn't include some wild cards of groups that could pop up, or if there's a big a deepening of a conflict in, say, Israel-Palestine, that some other group might capitalize and become a danger to the United States. Khorasan was the one that was getting a lot of attention this past weekend. That's one that Clapper said is, at least in the vicinity, as dangerous as the Islamic State. Yet you also still hear about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. A good number of experts, the chairs of the intelligence committees, will say that's one that we need to worry about maybe more than the others. They have a track record of actually trying to carry out these attacks on the United States and inspiring them here among homegrown terrorists in a way that other groups don't quite have since 9/11. So that's another big one. And then there are a whole variety of other groups in varying states of power. Al-Nusra would be one, Al-Shabaab. And some of them are weakened, including AQ Prime, but they can be revived. And again, it goes back to the point about the Islamic State and where they came from.
Jerry, you mentioned, you pointed out last week that the action against Islamic State may actually inspire some of these other groups to step forward in an opportunistic way. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I think that if you talk to U.S. officials, they worry about Islamic State to some extent. But in terms of the near-term danger, one of the things they worry about more are the groups that you're talking about, but also the fact that they may have an incentive that they didn't have a couple of months ago to mount a strike. What's the incentive? Well, the incentive is Islamic State is sucking all the air out of the extremist room. They're sucking all the oxygen away from other groups. If you're running Al-Qaeda, if you're running Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, if you're running Al-Nusra, you suddenly have a need to prove your relevance, that you're still here, you still matter. How do you do that? Well, one of the things you do is you pull the trigger, if you can, on a big strike against the West. Maybe not necessarily here, maybe in Europe, but you make the point, hey guys, we're still around too. And I think that's a legitimate concern. It is also sort of a testament to how much Islamic State has changed the game in a short period of time. You raised the question of who are we fighting against. There's also the question of who are we fighting with against Islamic State. And do people see the threat the same way? I think there's disagreement here about whether Islamic State poses the biggest threat or not. I think that's part of the confusion that has everybody feeling as nervous. The bottom line is, as you said, that the one thing that's clear in our polling and that you get a sense of just from listening to the conversation on the Hill in the last couple of weeks is that to the extent Americans had decided steadily over the last 7 years that the threat, the 9/11 kind of threat against them and the homeland had receded, that's reversed in the last month.
Are the beheadings the most significant uptick driver of sentiment since 9/11?
I think so. I mean, you look at, if you just base it on public polling, you can't see a similar spike. You see drifts up and down in the fear factor, but nothing like what happened in August.
So you have a spike in fear, you have multi-pronged threats, and you have a Congress that's not debating it. I'll start with Steve on this because Congress has given way to the sitting president on war action for a generation now. But start with Steve, but open to the panel. Aren't we experiencing a slow-motion constitutional crisis?
So yes and no. And I think that the yes is, in some ways, we're experiencing the same constitutional crisis that we've been experiencing since the rise of unilateral presidential war making in the Cold War, but first and now today. I think no, at the moment, that this isn't sort of different in degree. This isn't different in kind, it's just maybe different in degree, because at least for the moment, the president has plausible, if not self-evident, statutory arguments to make. That is to say, I mean, the president has, at least through his advisor, suggested that authority to go after ISIS for the moment can be derived from the statute Congress passed 1 week after 9/11, the authorization for use of military force, the AUMF, entirely because ISIS is the successor to, inheritor of Al-Qaeda's legacy. That's a dubious statutory argument. We can sort of hash it out, although I think that will bore everybody to tears, but it's not implausible. And I think the moment when this becomes a real constitutional crisis is when you have a threat for which there is no plausible statutory authority, where Congress clearly endorses the notion that the president should act, but refuses to provide the authority. And I don't think that's beyond the ken in the next 2 years. I think that could easily happen. I'm just not sure we're there yet with ISIS.
Cully, Heritage has something to say about that. You're releasing a paper later this week on the varying views on the right on whether the president should seek new authorities, right?
Right. We're releasing a paper on ISIS and whether or not an ISIS-specific AUMF would be appropriate. We trace the history of AUMFs, point out that we only declared war twice in recent memory, and the reason that most war actions have actually been cabined in the form of a specifically designed AUMF. And we break out the 5 constituent parts of that and say that if the Congress is not convinced of the president's legal arguments that ISIS grew out of the 2004 Ayman al-Zawahiri marriage, that even though he's dead, and there's this break from core al-Qaeda, that you can't make the case, then Congress needs to, well, first, the president should be proposing an AUMF, but if they don't, then Congress could look at these various proposals, Keynes and the other few that are out there. But I would be remiss if I didn't wish Just Security a happy birthday. It's a must-read, but so is Lawfare blog, and I think when you read both of them together, you really get a good sense of what's happening in the legal academy. Ben Wittes, who founded Lawfare blog, gave a speech at my alma mater, Kenyon College, this week on Constitution Day. I guess it was last week. And he talked about how the Constitution is under stress over the last decade because of the various machinations from both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. He gave various examples, which I won't go into, but I think there's some merit in that argument. I agree with Steve's point as well.
Look, so Ben's speech I think is worth listening to, but I do think it's worth stressing the very different constitutional question that we're grappling with today versus 5-10 years ago. The question today is not what happens when you have a president gleefully defying acts of Congress that were enacted to impose limits on his authority on a regular basis on the ground that those statutes are unconstitutional. The question today is what happens when you have a president who is convinced that some force needs to be used to quell a threat to the United States, where Congress apparently agrees, where there seems to be more than a majority in both houses that support some form of statute, some form of new legislation, but where they just can't get their heads together, whether for political reasons or for logistical reasons or for other reasons that are unknown to us. And I think that's the constitutional crisis that worries me, which is not when you have Congress saying one thing and the president saying something else. That happens all the time. That's happened going back to the founding. It's when you actually have complete agreement among the political branches, but a refusal to actually do what the Constitution requires, which is at some point to pass new legislation.
And I'm wondering if, I might take slight disagreement with you on that, because I think, while there might be a consensus for action on something related to the AUMF, there's still such a great division between all the factions within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party that in many ways it's easier for Congress to just not do anything. That it's easier for them to just say, you know what, let the president go right now until something gets out of hand and they don't like what he's doing. And it's, this issue of Congress sort of willingly ceding authority to the president is interesting. I don't know if I'd call it a constitutional crisis. It's certainly an interesting constitutional dynamic. I think roll call, we had a story today that said this would be the most do-nothing Congress of all time, unless they pass something like 100 bills in the lame duck session. So it does give you a sense of how...
I'm taking the under on that. That's right.
And so just, it's interesting how much you see, a president go to Congress and say, I want something, until he starts thinking about the ramifications of Congress saying, maybe we don't like it quite the way you do. And there's a CIA director that shall go unnamed who wants, there was a period of time where the CIA was trying to be a little bit more open and public about, wanting to work with Congress. All of them say we want to work with Congress, but they were making a little bit of effort. And he had been saying this in public, and I asked him about, what do you think about the authorization bill that's coming up? And very privately, he used some curse words to describe how much he didn't care that Congress passed an authorization bill.
But, David, I thought something interesting, subtle but interesting, happened here in the last few weeks in regard to the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch, which is President Obama, and to his credit, I think, came out and said, I think I have the ability to act here on my own. But I invite you in Congress to please authorize something. Get with me here. Do something. Now, the executive branch, and some of us have been doing this for a long time, and the tendency in the executive branch is to say to the legislative branch, stay as far away from me as humanly possible. Anything you do will just be an encumbrance on me, so please go away. He didn't say that in this case. He said, please authorize something so that there's a sense that we're moving together here. I ask you to do this. And they didn't really. I mean, they authorized training and arming Syrian rebels with no dollar sign attached, and quit there and went home for elections. So I think that's a different dynamic between the two branches.
So do I, and contrast that with Kosovo. I mean, right, with Kosovo in 1999, I mean, the House had a vote on whether to authorize airstrikes, and the vote was, if I remember right, it was a tie, right, where the House split like 216 to 216. So that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a House that had legislation before it and rejected it. We're talking about bills that aren't getting to the floor. Right. And I think that's a very different situation.
And I think this gets to Jerry's earlier point about the interesting polling where the American people were saying, we want you to do this, and then when the president did this, they didn't reward him for it. I think the American people are very much looking for a government that can do something successfully abroad. They're worried that they're not going to see it. And so you get this funny back and forth where they say, we want you to do something, but we don't really believe you're going to succeed, and we don't want to fail again. And that's an even bigger problematic dynamic than this constitutional dynamic, is this loss of faith in the American government to act effectively from both parties.
If I could just pick up on what Jerry said, part of the reason I think that happened, which I give credit to the president for doing that, because that's a healthy way of signaling to them, let's work together, is because of what happened last year on the Syria situation. Sure. Okay, so it was, as described by a colleague of ours, sort of like two teenagers trying to figure out who's going to ask the first one out on a date. He didn't want to really put forward an AUMF proposal. The Congress didn't really want to reward him by giving him one. The compressed time schedule didn't really allow Congress to do their constitutional duty by actually staying in town and doing it, because they wanted to go home on recess again so they could get themselves reelected. Query, what would happen if Congress, if it was an election year and Congress's legislative calendar lasted through October and November? Who knows? But it's very clear to me that by saying what he said, he's very open to an AUMF, and I think they realize that there is this vigorous debate in the legal academy about the efficacy of the 2001 AUMF, and they're wildly open to a narrowly tailored ISIS-specific AUMF.
But just remember, I think it was a speech last May, not this most recent May, but last May, where he said the same thing. I invite Congress to work with me on a new AUMF.
Well, and to refine and repeal the old one.
To refine and repeal the old one. And he never put forward a proposal that I'm aware of, and not long thereafter, defense officials testified to Congress, we're good with the AUMF as we are. Right. So it's hard to tell how sincere he is. I mean, I think it might be it's certainly a very different situation than last year. So it might be more sincere this time.
Right. Well, I'm no surprise that a constitutional law professor would be interested in what other constitutional law professors have to say. But can we go back to August of last year? Did Obama make a mistake not forcing that vote? I mean, he asked for the vote. He said this time I think it was can't do business as usual, a very forceful Rose Garden speech. 11 days later, late at night on a Saturday.
Well, look, it was a pivot point. I mean, I think almost everything that's happened in administration foreign policy since then is to some degree or another judged against the backdrop of what happened that week in August. And the White House doesn't like to hear that, but I think that's true here. It's true in terms of relations with Congress. It's probably even more true in terms of the way people abroad see the U.S. and see the Obama administration. And I think that what the president has done on Islamic State and the coalition building associated with the decision to go on the offensive is starting to pull back some of that, but I still think it was a big moment, and I think it did affect lots of things that happened in the year subsequent.
And having been involved from afar, but closely in that vote, there weren't the votes. Yeah. They just didn't have the numbers, and so they didn't want to bring it to a vote. And they didn't have the numbers because the constituent mail was running against that vote. I don't remember the numbers for every single senator that I was talking with, but it was 90 to 10. The numbers were overwhelming. And so there wasn't a beheading video. There wasn't a forcing function at that point. And you have to eventually go back to the American people if you are a member of Congress.
Let's follow up on that, because you did say the American people are uncertain that there would be a successful, that we'll have a measure of success. And I want to go back to something that you've written about, which was that the U.S. has done a poor job of getting partner militaries to become more functional, that these ad hoc coalitions can fail because of the use of patronage and regime mentality. What's the prospect of success with this coalition?
I am not privy to the classified documents on this one, and I really hope that it looks better than it does from the outside. from the outside, most militaries are not set up the way our military is to actually protect the people of your country and the territory of your country. Most militaries are set up to protect the regime or to make money. And based on that, we give them money, we try to train them, but their fundamental purpose is different than what we want them to do. And that's a real problem when you want them to be a militia with you to go after a bad guy like this.
Absolutely no. Cully, you know, some of these states that we're dealing with, you would have seen a lot of confidential information about. Are you any more confident?
Look, this isn't a partisan issue. At least it shouldn't be. We need the coalition to win. And the one thing we haven't talked about here is leadership. The president, any president in his 6th year, and maybe in the future her 6th year, needs to regroup, needs to reassess the people around him or her, and then needs to have a clear vision for the next 2 years. And this is one of those classic cases in point where the president needs to lead. And he needs to lead and make the case. I mean, Jerry's point, Tim's point about the sort of island of misfit toys, all the various constituent parts voting for the rebel funding bill. I mean, there's a lot of different types of folks voting. What didn't split along party lines. That actually is an opportunity, I see, politically, to put together the right type of winning legal argument and political argument for us to win. I think the administration needs to be more forthright, honest, and direct about who this coalition is and what they're going to do. I know that's going to be very hard because there are going to be things that they can't talk about. But the American people, when we hear we're going to war, are used to turning on CNN or their favorite cable show and the next day seeing the crosshairs and bombs going off. We're not seeing that. And so we're like, well, what the heck's going on? And so there's an emotional aspect here that the people aren't getting what they're hearing. They're hearing that we're at war, they're not seeing we're at war.
Steve, do you think we need a new sort of legal framework on partners?
Yes, but I mean, I think, you know, it's, if you look at, and we alluded to this before with the kinds of countries we're talking about enlisting in this coalition against ISIS. I mean, when you're talking about, you know, the Assad regime in Syria, when you're talking about Iran, and the question is, how do we actually go to bed at night feeling comfortable with the fact that the enemy of our enemy is all of a sudden our not so bad enemy? So I think we do need a new framework. It would be nice if we were able to exert some kind of leverage and put strings on the aid we are providing and on the support we are seeking. The problem is that, as Cully just pointed out, we need them at the moment, perhaps at least as much as they need us. And, you know, as long as that's going to be true, it's going to be very hard for us to impose conditions. And I think that's going to create a very bad incentive structure where the kind of support we need, especially in the Middle East, is going to come from countries who are not going to say, oh, we'll do it and we'll improve our human rights record, or we'll do it on condition of these other things you want us to do. I think they're going to exact as much leverage out of that as they can, and I think we're in a relatively weak position on this scale. So I think we do need it. I don't think we're going to get it.
Right. You know, going back to partners, when Obama backed down, and I guess it was September 10th or 11th last year, he said he was dispatching John Kerry to talk to Russia, on our partner in peace there. So talk about the difference in 1 year since then. John Kerry this morning, I want to go back to Steve and talk be a bit wonky here on frameworks and legalities. Kerry seemed to be describing the Islamic State as a state, you know, that they control territory, that they have a funding flow, et cetera. Was that the beginnings of an argument for a new aim?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think, so whether the U.S. government is on the precipice of recognizing Islamic State as a state strikes me as a very dangerous proposition, because recognizing any entity as a state, first of all, is recognizing some claim to territory, which presumably is going to piss off the territory that's being claimed by another state. But second, it also creates all kinds of obligations and rights under international law that I can't imagine we have any interest in recognizing on the part of the Islamic State. Sovereignty, right, the ability to act in self-defense. So I don't know if that rhetoric is designed to sort of hail in some kind of move toward recognizing statehood or toward some kind of clearer focus that this is a group that we're going after, not because they're just a scattered terrorist group, but because unlike many of the other groups that pose a threat to the U.S. right now, they control wide swaths of territory. And it's the territory that changes the game insofar as it gives them a larger base of operations. It makes them more secure from just, you know, action by other countries' law authorities. So I don't know that this is the beginning of anything other than just a nomenclature change. I can't imagine that this is any step toward formal recognition.
Is this what Cully's point about people are not being able to see the sort of normal atmospherics and imagery of war? Maybe that was just Kerry trying to create that.
Yeah, it's possible. Although I think the consequences are so dire. I mean, right? That you know, the last thing we want. I mean, just to draw an analogy, right? This was the one bridge Lincoln wouldn't cross during the Civil War. Lincoln would never recognize the Confederacy as a country, because his view was the second you do that, you confer upon them a legitimacy that the whole point of this operation is to deny to them.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, talk about what the practical effect that our partners, Jordan and Turkey. Today we're seeing a lot about huge problems with refugees, a lot of reaction. This is in your wheelhouse. Do we have not a lot of time to make an effective pushback to ease this refugee crisis, particularly in Turkey? Obviously, it's been going on for years.
So the refugee crisis, I mean, we're seeing it now on our TVs, and so suddenly it's real to us. This started years ago, 2 years ago, with the beginning of the Syrian war, really, 3 years ago now, at the beginning of the trickle, and it's been a serious issue in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan. The destabilization of those states is quite real, but also remember they're little boys and girls growing up in those refugee camps. And what are they seeing? What are their parents doing? What are they seeing on their TVs? Seeing your parents helpless in the face of something does something to a child. The more years they're in those camps, the more you're going to see a generation growing up with this normality. Now that does things, we know now, not just to the emotions, but to the brain. Brain science is now telling us the kinds of violence that causes in people, the impulse control that changes. You don't want generations growing up in refugee camps, and you don't want grown-ups not being able to work and the kids seeing that. And I think we're going to see that for this generation in the Middle East. So yes, we want to be dealing with this soon. And we've been trying from a humanitarian perspective. You know, Secretary Clinton started putting money into humanitarian action there, and we're probably going to need a lot more.
Kali, what kind of a drain is that on a country like Jordan?
I have no idea. I'm not Jordanian. But I can only imagine from what I've read and what I've seen, and when I talk to my friends in the military, and I served for 23 years, so I have a lot of friends in the military, that it's debilitating. I mean, if you just look at the number of people in these refugee camps ready to cross the river in the last week, and the pictures coming out, I mean, it makes Katrina and the numbers of people fleeing New Orleans look like not much. And they weren't being, shot at, and weren't afraid that, an American ISIS group was going to come after them. So, I mean, I share Rachel's concern. I also agree 100% with what Steve just said. I mean, I don't think Secretary Kerry meant literally that they're a state. I think it was just more of a colloquial expression.
Mm-hmm. Tim, talk about, has any of this had a purchase on lawmakers, the idea of the refugee problem in the briefings last week? Was that coming to the fore?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and it's a big part of what some of our future expenses might be. So in addition to the humanitarian impact, there is a sense that this is something we're going to be wrestling with as a part of the cost of this new military action against ISIS or the Islamic State for a long time to come. Right, we're already talking about $75 million a day, I believe the Pentagon said last month, right when we first started ramping this up. And the refugee crisis can really, really add to these kind of costs. It already was doing it in Syria, for instance, when Syria was getting out of control. And now that it's getting even worse and spreading, it's becoming even more of a problem. And the lawmakers have to pay attention to it.
Right.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Tim's right, but I think there's something even bigger happening here. The combination of the refugee crisis and the fact that ISIS has claimed, as you said, huge swaths of territory. Whole countries are being changed here. The border between Iraq and Syria does not exist anymore. The demographic composition of Lebanon has changed. The demographic composition of Jordan has changed. The demographic composition of Iraq has changed. The demographic composition of Syria is a mess. So none of those states, as we're speaking now, and certainly over time, are going to exist the way we thought of them 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly. What are the consequences of that? Well, I think one of the consequences of that is that the adult states of the region need to sort of step up. I mean, the real countries with real civilizations, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia. I mean, adult countries that are real countries that have functioning governments are going to have to step in at some point, not just the U.S., at least in my opinion. And what form that takes, I don't know. But these other states are not going to be able to take care of themselves. They practically don't exist now, at least not in the form we've always thought of them.
I'm thinking about, there's several bitter ironies about this situation for this president. One, the president wanted to get out of Iraq, going back into Iraq. Also, the president who ran for president saying that his predecessor or the incumbent had put 2 wars on a credit card. We're doing that again. Tim, you want to talk a little bit about how unsustainable that is?
Yeah, I mean, once they come back after the elections, I don't mean the lame duck, but once they get back in the House and Senate with the new Congress, that's going to be a very, very major component of what happens when we're looking at the overall budget, the defense budget, the mandatory cuts that have been put into place. And then when you have, there'd been this attempt to try and move everything back into the base Pentagon budget, and that's now being completely reversed. And it might have to be. There might be arguments for why it has to be, but it certainly is a weird position for this president to be in, that he's going to be doing a war on credit card.
Right. We have many, many national security issues to go, and we're going to move on to them in a second, but I'll just go back to Jerry on this one. Do people in the administration acknowledge that the president may wind up being in the spot that Dempsey indicated he might be in, and Robert Gates said over the weekend that you cannot turn back the Islamic State or these various groups without some sort of combat troop?
I don't think they acknowledge that point. I'm not sure it needs to be acknowledged. I'm not sure it's right. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I think what General Odierno said last week, which got a little mangled in the translation, was the important point. He said, yeah, there have to be boots on the ground if you're going to roll back a military, which is what the Islamic State is, that has taken territory. They don't have to be American boots. They just have to be somebody's boots. And that's where I think we are right now. And can they be somebody else's boots? Well, I think there's a lot of skepticism and cynicism, but that doesn't mean the answer is no by any means.
But you're talking about the adult states in the region. And the Syrian Free Army is up to the job?
We'll find out.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yes, we will. So if any of you discerned an answer to any of that for these questions, please let us know in the question period. So national security is broader than what we've been talking about for the last 35, 40 minutes. And let's talk about other manifestations of that and the politics. Steve, you've written on Just Security about possible political realignment on the issue of privacy rights and national security, and how last year's attempt at a rollback of the NSA's data collection was an indication of a possible emerging new alliance. And I think everybody here has something to say about that. Let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think this is, this goes back to the point that we heard before about ISIS consuming all the oxygen. I mean, one of the things that ISIS pushed off of the radar was surveillance reform. And I think this was, an issue that obviously was sparked last summer by the Snowden revelations, and where there really was, I think, clear impetus for at least some change in the House, in the Senate, and it wasn't the good old-fashioned left-right divide. And so I wrote this post about a year ago about how one of the things we saw in the surveillance conversation was a strange, albeit not entirely unpredictable, alignment between the libertarian wing of the Republican Party and the liberal wing of the Democratic Party against the middles of both. And so there was a vote last summer, for example, to defund the telephone metadata program. It lost in the House 217 to 205, which we would look at and say, oh, that must have been, some Republicans defected, but otherwise it was right down party lines. And it was anything but. Right? It was actually one of the more divided ideological votes we've seen. So I think this is a possible moment that just hasn't happened yet. And I think part of what ISIS has done is push it even further into the distance. But at some point by next spring, Congress is going to have to pass some kind of surveillance reform because Section 215, the statute at the heart of the metadata program, is going to expire. And so for better or for worse, we're going to have some legislation come out of Congress. The House has already passed the, in my view, sillily named USA Freedom Act. The Senate has a bill that the White House has apparently signed off on. I think the real question is there going to be a meeting of the minds before this Congress goes home? And if not, if the very different Senate that comes back in January, they're going to be willing to, push for the same deal. At the end of the day, though, I think the real question is it going to be the Democrats versus the Republicans? Or is it going to be the liberals and the libertarians, what Congressman Labrador called the wingnut coalition, which he gets to say since he's one of them, right, against the sort of more conventional hearts of the parties. We'll see. I mean, I wrote that a year ago, and we're still here.
Cully, do you think this is a political alignment that can get something done in lame duck or the next Congress?
I think things are moving so quickly we have no way of knowing. Because I think when Steve wrote what he wrote, he was exactly right. And a few months later, he was exactly right. And then you have the beheadings, and you have ISIS. You have all these other things that are happening. So I think what's happening is you see, for example, the libertarian wing of the Republican Party sort of pulling back on some of their statements, some of their desires for certain policies. You see Rand Paul's lawsuit against NSA is on hold for now. That's for legal reasons, but I think that serves a political purpose too. So I think what's going to happen is, and God forbid any horrible terrorist attack happens here in this country, so I'm assuming for the sake of my point that it doesn't, is that you're going to have a renewed sense of sort of neo-realism starting in the new Congress, that, okay, we need some form of surveillance. Let the adults get in the room. We understand what you're saying, we understand what you're saying, but we have to do something because Section 215 is going to expire in May. We need some form of boots on the ground in Iraq. Not us, probably, for now, but who? And how do we really actually vet these folks? Are we any good at vetting these folks? I mean, we saw what we did with in Iraq and Afghanistan, training Afghan National Army people, Iraqi Army people. We had green on green, we had blue on green, we had all sorts of various insider attacks. That's going to happen, and that's going to dampen the spirit of what we're doing, but we can't let it quench the resolve to get it done at the end of the day.
I mean, I guess there's one there's one actor we haven't talked about yet, and I guess the million-dollar question is if and when they're going to say anything, and that's the courts. So Cully talked about Rand Paul's lawsuit. Of course, there's already been oral argument in the Federal Appeals Court in New York in the ACLU's challenge to the 215 program. There's a very important, albeit largely overlooked challenge right now in Colorado to the much larger intelligence gathering program under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. It's entirely possible that the more that the political branches drag their feet on these matters, the more the court might be pressed into at least some kind of action. I'm not holding my breath that the Supreme Court is in a hurry to restore the heyday of Warren Court era privacy protections. But it was no greater a liberal than Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion this June in Riley, a case about searching cell phones, where Chief Justice Roberts wrote about just how much different qualitatively the data is that we store on our cell phones versus stuff we carry on a person, and how that technology changes the privacy analysis. If the court really means that, then Congress may drag its feet long enough to leave the courts no other choice but to actually jump in.
Right, but before it gets to the nation's top court, we get a multiplicity of opinions along the way. Right?
Indeed, and so we'll get a decision from the Second Circuit presumably sometime in the next couple of months. There's another appeal brought by Larry Klayman here in DC that's going to be argued later this fall. So by sometime next spring, we're going to have at least 2 circuit court opinions on the telephone metadata program. We're going to have a district court opinion on Section 702. It's going to percolate. It's going to take a while. I guess all I'm saying is if Congress really goes the narrowest route possible, which is to just look at 215, I think the courts may actually finally feel impelled to do something.
Can you handicap the cases as most likely? Not the outcomes, but those.
This is why I'm a law professor, not a poker player. But I think the district courts in the 215 cases split on the Fourth Amendment question, which is to say, do Americans have an expectation of privacy in their telephone metadata? I think both of the appeals courts are going to resist the holding that the answer is yes. But there's a narrower way out. There's a narrow way out to say Congress never actually authorized the telephone metadata program. So without reaching the constitutional issue, we can just say it's not authorized by statute. That fits quite nicely with Congress having to reauthorize the statute anyway by next May. The much harder question, and I think the much bigger case, is the Section 702 challenge, the overseas bulk collection that's going on in Colorado. And there I have no idea.
Which allows the collection, if someone calls me a foreign national, that my data is collected within.
It's a little more complicated than that. The question is, where is the collection happening? And so the way that 702 works is it authorizes certain intelligence agencies to basically mass collect information going through foreign servers, so long as they are targeting non-U.S. persons reasonably believed to be outside the United States. The result is not, they can't target a communication that they know that you're a party to, but the way technology works, it's just inevitable that in sweeping everything up that's going through these fiber optic cables, these nodes, they're going to collect millions and millions of communications of U.S. persons anyway. And so they're probably picking up your phone calls accidentally.
Right. Rachel, I mean, given the fact that we've talked such a bulk of this conversation about foreign threats and the fear of terrorism, is it possible that, once again, privacy concerns will be overwhelmed by this wave of concern about terrorism?
I think particularly the younger generation doesn't share many of our privacy concerns, and so I think it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But I think a lot of issues are being overwhelmed by the talk in Washington that, as someone who lives in Colorado, are still very live in the States. So the immigration debate has not gone away in the States. It is still very there, and in certain subsections of the population, it is very salient. The Honduras, Guatemala, kids coming up from El Salvador, that issue is still very real. I was stuck in Dallas getting my plane rebooked, and the woman behind the counter was talking to me about Honduras and whether she should go down there and help those kids. That's the she was with a church. That's the kind of issue that people in Texas are thinking about. And so those issues have not gone away. We're not dealing with them here. Congress has certainly been kicking the can for a long time. The courts are getting involved to some extent, but they're going to have to pick those issues back up. And to make a very broad analogy, tomorrow I'm running a conference, an international conference on violence, and one of the things we're looking at is what do we know about violence? One thing we know about violence from Mexico is that when you have a series of cartels that are fighting each other, and a government comes in and fights one of them, you actually don't just weaken that one cartel, you start violence between the cartels because one's weak and so now everyone else wants their turf. You start succession crises within the one that you're attacking, and so you get more violence there. And then, of course, you have state on cartel violence. So you basically metastasize the violence. We're about to do that in the Middle East. When you look at what we're doing in the Middle East right now against the one group that we're going after versus all the rest, we're about to pull a Mexico 2 years ago. And I think that the American people are going to notice that just the way they noticed what was going on at our southern border. And we're pretty scared, the border states. We're pretty worried.
Right. Jerry, the problem hasn't gone away, but has it faded as a concern for people, as evidenced in your poll?
The
child migrants and immigration?
The immigration question? Oh, it's not faded at all. I think Rachel's absolutely right. If you ask people what they worry about, the immigration worry is very high on their radar screen. It kind of comes and goes, and there was a tendency in Washington to conclude, I don't know what, 2 months ago that Congress wasn't going to deal with it, so check it off the list for the year, put it on the back burner. But that's not, at least the polling suggests that's not the way Americans look at it at all. I think it's very much on their minds, and that's not to say that there's a consensus about what to do about it. That I think the country is almost as divided as Washington on that question. But in terms of what do we worry about, it's still very much there.
And do lawmakers worry about it too? Absolutely,
yeah. And this will be one of those interesting, what happens if the Senate changes control kind of questions. Let's go back to the surveillance thing for one moment, just to give you a sense of how things can change. A few years ago, it would have been a pretty easy prediction for me to say they're just going to renew, because that's what they did, and there was no real forcing factor. And then once the NSA surveillance came about, the wingnut faction that Steve mentioned got very vocal, and it got to the point, and I was talking about this with Cully briefly. In July, before some of this ISIS and Islamic State issue became as big a deal as it was, there was an amendment on the floor to sunset the AUMF bill, and 30 House Republicans voted for it. Yeah. I don't know that number would be the same if that came to the floor today. And then that goes to the question of what happens if the Senate changes control. The bill would probably be very different than the one that they were looking at recently. And I think there would be a different emphasis on terrorist travel. I think that might even push it even further toward the border security side of things. And then where the child migrant issue factors in is a little harder to figure. But it does, the way people might change on surveillance reform is so interesting too. The Senate has been a little more conservative on the notion of being really going after and restricting the NSA bill, or the NSA's operations, because the Senate has more traditional sort of national security-oriented Republicans than some of the more libertarian-oriented House members.
But it's worth stressing, though, I mean, and I don't mean to get too far into the weeds, there are material differences between the version of the USA Freedom Act, I really hate that name, that passed the House, and the version that was introduced by Senator Leahy and that has the backing of the Obama administration. And virtually all of those differences redound in favor of privacy and civil liberties in the Senate bill as compared to the House bill. Right, that the House bill is much more, it changes the status quo much less. It responds to the concerns raised by the Snowden allegations in a much more superficial manner. And so I think if Tim is right, that a change in control of the Senate means a weaker bill in the Senate, I actually think that's going to be a big loss for the privacy and civil liberties movement that really seemed to be sparked last summer by Snowden, because it means we're going to get legislation that's really not going to accomplish that much compared to where we started.
Cully, do you agree with that?
I agree, but the thing I would add is those same concerns may not be around next spring or summer, depending on how things play out.
Right.
They may be tamped down somewhat. And so I agree with the name problem, too. I think it's silly. Washington's great at that. The only institution that's better is the Pentagon, where I worked. But, yeah, I think that, you know, when you're talking about the immigration piece, you saw Jay Johnson testify last week. He's the Secretary of Homeland Security. And folks were asking him, well, how many people from not South America, not Mexico, were crossing the border, trying to basically say how many terrorists were coming across the border. And he had to agree that there were folks from Yemen and other countries that had came across. There's no evidence that I've seen publicly that ISIS is trying to come into Mexico and pay a coyote and cross the Rio Grande River. I mean, there's 3,000 plus Americans who have passports and Western Europeans who have joined ISIS. They can just hop on a plane and come into JFK. They don't have to cross the Rio Grande River. So I think, you know, assuming no, God forbid, any terrorist attack between now and the spring when we have to really take a hard look at the reforms to FISA, you might be right that the House version prevails. You might see the Leahy bill have legs, but I think it's way too early to tell. I think it's too early to tell how that's going to play out.
But the fact that we're even having this conversation, I mean, right, the fact that we're now on to what happens in the spring, I think just underscores just how all-inclusive ISIS has been. Because I would never have thought that this bill wouldn't be done by the midterms 6 months ago, 3 months ago, because this was agenda item number one, and it looked like the whole reason why Senator Leahy had spent basically all summer getting the intelligence community to sign onto a bill was that they could get it through the Senate on the conference before the midterms. So the fact that this is even up in the air, I think, proves just how much ISIS has taken over the politics of national security.
And it's amazing how much people who had been on such opposite pages of this debate had all somewhat come to basically the same place. I mean, you could never, on intelligence issues, you can hardly get Leahy and Feinstein on the same page. And all of a sudden, they were moving very close to each other and basically arrived.
Well, let's move on to a couple other hot spots before our time runs out. Secretary of State Kerry was lauding what he called an extraordinary achievement in Afghanistan, the unity agreement. Are we overselling? Is he overselling our position there?
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask the two co-presidents, if that's what they are, I suppose, that question. I guess I would cynically answer just about everything that's been promised in Afghanistan for 12 years has been oversold, so I'm not sure why this would be different. However, you know, I mean, to the extent the administration had a view, and I think there was a plausible reason for it, that anything that followed President Karzai was going to be an improvement is still a plausible enough position to hold. So if that's your standard, this is definitely progress. It's certainly progress compared to what seemed possible a couple of weeks ago. You know, I think the hard questions now begin, though. What is the understanding about security arrangements? Is there a status of forces agreement that's plausible now? Will it exist? And if it does exist, will the U.S. act on it? You know, those are all questions that now start to be discussed. They're nowhere near to being resolved.
Right. I was going to say, Rachel, put your fragile state hat on and talk about Afghanistan and where we're at.
Well, I happen to know Ashraf Ghani, and his son is a close friend, and so I really hope this works out because he's literally worried for his dad's life. And he's got good reason to worry. The history of power sharing agreements is that they tend to freeze conflict. And that's probably, the best case scenario here, I think, is a frozen conflict in Afghanistan, so you don't get a live war breaking out right now. And you give everyone some time to breathe, you get a status of forces agreement, you start getting a functioning government. Ashraf Ghani is a very smart man. He wrote the book literally on fragile states. He's a very thoughtful man about how to put these things back together. And he makes some shrewd political judgments, like bringing a warlord onto his ticket, which he needed to do to win an election in Afghanistan. And so I think if anyone can do it, Ashraf can do it. I don't believe in putting our eggs all in the basket of a champion, though. I think as America, we need to be looking at how do you sort of shape the institutional arrangements there with the status of forces agreement and so on to ensure peace, because the history of these things is that conflict can break out over time as the principles start going at it.
Sounds like a little bit of optimism in there, and I'm glad we have it on this panel. Let me just throw this out to everyone. Has Europe and the U.S. reached the limits of their restraint on Vladimir Putin? And should we be worried about that?
No. Well, no, I don't think we've reached the limits of our restraint. Should we be worried about that? Yes.
Yes.
That's, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, tell Cully, what's your view on where we're at in Ukraine? Because Putin has played a very opportunistic game earlier in the summer when we were looking this way, pushing forward on that. We're in that same position again. We are distracted and politically frozen, and our lawmakers are out on the road. So should we be worried?
Look, if you asked 50 people walking down the street, show me where the Ukraine is on a map, most couldn't point it out.
If you ask 50 people, show me where Washington, D.C. is on the map.
Right, or who's the vice president, they would come up with a different name than you would hope for. People understand beheadings in videos. People understand terrorist events. I don't think the American people really have that much of a concern about Putin being Putin and doing what Putin was designed to do, which was reach out and grab more territory and try to protect his people, or what he perceives to be protecting his people. And so part of that the fact that I think that that's true, I think will motivate Congress. Now, Congress is interested in this. The president, I think, speaking of neorealism, realizes what Putin's about. The Congress realizes what Putin's about. And I think, but if you put the same question to me that you put to Jerry, I don't know where it's going to end, because I don't know. I mean, there's a point where sanctions, when they're so extreme, there's the old law of unintended consequences comes into being. So I don't know how far we can push them before Europeans and others sort of say back off. And then there's, of course, the Iranian equation that fits into that as well.
I would have thought that the shootdown of MH17 would have been the beheading episode of this conversation, which is to say that the shootdown was the spark that ignited the powder keg and that finally got folks to actually pay attention. And I think it got the American public's attention for about 3 days, maybe 4. Certainly it got the European public's attention for a lot longer. But I think the question is really going to be here, unlike in the ISIS context, what's Europe going to do and are we going to follow? And are we going to try to bolster up what Europe decides to do? And asking what Europe is going to do is, I think, an even more fraught question politically these days than asking what this or the next Congress is going to do. Because I think, it's rare to see the Dutch get exercised about anything. But I would have thought that would have been the moment. And at least thus far, it seems to have had at best a modest effect on the European appetite for really aggressive sanctions toward Russia.
And some of that, of course, this is common sense to a certain degree, but some of that comes from how dependent Europe is on Russian energy compared to what we are. So it's easier for us to be a little ahead of Europe. But one of the interesting things about Ukraine and how people might be relating to it in the voting booth is the way Republicans are talking about it. They're talking about Ukraine as an example of the failure of the president's leadership. They're putting it in a list of examples. They're not saying, they're not railing on Ukraine. They're saying there's a narrative they're trying to build about the president being a failure, basically, and they can use this as a check mark on that example.
Can I offer a slightly contrarian view? I think actually one of the surprising things about the Ukraine-Russia situation is the extent to which the Europeans have not headed for the exits on sanctions. I mean, you know, Putin very cleverly created a golden opportunity for them to do that. The NATO meeting was happening. He creates a ceasefire in Ukraine, the terms of which he dictates himself, which is kind of odd since he claims he's not involved in the conflict, but nevertheless, he said basically, here's a ceasefire, which is going to work this way, this way, and this way, just as everybody's gathering for the NATO meeting. And the Europeans don't do what I think I expected them to do, which is say, oh, great, a ceasefire. Let's back off. They actually went the next step. Now, maybe it's not enough, and maybe it's not as much as it should have, and certainly, as Tim is right, that it's harder for them than it is for us because we have very little economic skin in the game, but they did it. And I think by standards of kind of European behavior in similar crises over the last 20 years, that's pretty good, actually.
It's been very different. I agree.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is how it affects our own energy debate. Coming from Colorado, it's a big new energy state with gas and oil. You know, the export of oil and natural gas, we have all sorts of issues with can we export this? What Europe decides to do with its energy equation there, how much it wants to stay dependent on Russia now that it really sees how Russia's using it. That's going to start playing into our politics, but very much into European
And
politics.
it's an issue in Senator Udall's re-election race. Yep. And his opponent introduced a bill, and they both introduced their own energy independence kind of bills, and it was interesting to watch them try to. They weren't outdueling each other on national security. They were trying to outduel each other on energy.
Yeah, because you see the energy. I mean, you literally see the fracking and you see the mining going on as you drive down the road. It's everywhere.
And just to take it full circle, I mean, I think, Rachel talked about the problem of gerrymandering. Obviously, the one place where that's not an issue is the Senate. And so I think the one place where national security issues might actually show up, even if in odd clothing, such as the energy fight in Colorado, is in the 7, 8, 9 contested Senate races as we get sort of down to the wire. Are we going to see, one side try to actually raise the specter of national security and or civil liberties going forward as a wedge issue in the last couple of weeks before the election?
Right. Now, before we throw it open to questions, we have the small matter of Iran.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tim Starks.
So that's one of the things we haven't talked about, right?
That's right.
By November, we're supposed to either have a deal or not have a deal with them. What happens then, up to and including the lame duck, is anybody's guess. And then the elections can affect that in a big way. So let's say we have a deal. There will be a push by the administration, most likely, to reduce some of the sanctions we have on them over their nuclear program and some other nefarious activities. That probably will be pushed into next year, if that's the case. If there is no deal, I think you might see an immediate lame duck push to put some sanctions on Iran, because the president promised, no deal, we are going to sanction them. That's what he said. And then, of course, if the Republicans take control, what the president wants next year, in the event that there is a deal, gets much, much harder, because nobody wants to be seen as the people who eased up on Iran. That's not a popular position politically, but it is a position that is much less popular with Republicans. And real quick, some of the things I'm saying are things that my colleagues have passed along and shared with me and reported. But there are things that I think the Iran issue could, next to ISIS, next to the general issue of the defense budget, be the very top things that we're dealing with at the beginning of the 114th Congress, one way or the other.
I'm struck by the decided lack of optimism within the administration and elsewhere that a deal was going to happen. I don't know of anybody who puts the chances at better than 50-50. Most people put it below 50-50. So the real question is what then? I think Tim's right. You inevitably have to move further down the sanctions path because everybody has said that's the alternative. So then you have to do it. And Congress, you're right, will be more than happy to oblige. The administration's in a tougher spot because there is this ISIS problem and there is Iran next door, and you would like them to help on that, but it's complicated.
Yeah,
it's
you guys have seen that Sunni-Shia conflict really, really makes this even harder.
And by the way, at that point, you have a really interesting 2016 presidential campaign issue on your hands as well.
Well, and that's the elephant in the room. I mean, the elephant in the room here is, it's not going to be, national security is not going to be a huge issue in the midterms, except maybe on a couple of small topics in the Senate races. It's going to be sort of something that the 114th Congress has to deal with reluctantly, because they're probably going to have to pass something for ISIS. They're going to have to deal with surveillance reform. There's going to be appropriations bills at the very least. where they're going to have to figure out how to fund all of these enterprises. But it seems to me the real elephant in the room is how this starts to shape the primary fights heading into 2016. And I think especially on the Republican side, where I think there's going to be a real split between perhaps a, old school Goldwater Republican kind of candidate and perhaps someone with more libertarian roots. And I think that's very well where you could see national security becoming a wedge issue, even within the Republican Party.
And it's always much more of an issue, of course, in the presidential elections because it's a more decisive issue. The history of it affecting midterms, national security affecting midterm elections is pretty small. I mean, you can go back to like 2002, of course, where right after 9/11, everybody was thinking about this issue. But more or less since then, you haven't seen it become a dominant issue in the midterms. You have seen it in presidential races, and I think you're right that we'll see it more in 2016 as well.
And Rachel, you said, to bring it full circle, that's where the debate should unfold, right, on the national level and in general election, right?
Yeah, I think the American public deserves a debate, and I think we're going to get one. I think it'll be a very interesting one between the libertarians and the Goldwater Republicans. You'll probably see a similar split on the left as well. And I think we're going to get some real interesting discussion. I think it would be a pity if the discussion boils down to character alone. And I do worry that might happen, that are you tough enough? Are you not tough enough?
Will you repeal Obamacare?
We're in a very different world where that kind of strength is not really what we need. I used to say we need Spider-Man more than the Incredible Hulk. You need a sort of smarter, more lithe and flexible kind of strength than just rah-rah and beat your chest. But I don't know if that's what we're going to see in the debate. I think the character tends to boil down to a lowest common denominator.
But Kelly, I mean, as Rachel's implying, when you say something like we're leading from behind, it becomes a cudgel, a political, attack point. And it's not a very successful one, I think, in these midterms. But when you're articulating a new policy, it does get dangerous sometimes when you use a phrase that's like that.
It does, and it's not new, and character will be part of this presidential election round, just like it has been in the last 43. I do agree with Steve, though, that this spring and up till the summer recess, I think, will be a very robust period of debate regarding national security. Everything from when the Sissy's torture rendition report comes out to
I'm glad to say when, not if.
If it ever comes out. When it comes, I think it's going to come out. You'll have a military commissions case in the USS Cole bombing case, which will kick off this spring probably against al-Nashri. You'll have surveillance reform. And I think you'll really know we're in the thick of it if there's an appetite for revisiting the Budget Control Act and the sequester with respect to the defense budget. Because remember, twice now they've raised the caps of the BCA, the Budget Control Act, but they haven't lifted it. And so if they want to pull that Band-Aid off and really look at that, and the administration makes the case, because the administration did make a case for a larger than some people thought would happen defense budget this year, this cycle. We'll see whether, if that happens, then you know as a barometer that everyone's all in on this debate.
Well, so, and this is the beginning of a very long season of debate in Washington. I wanted to remind everyone of two things. One is following this event, we're going to have cocktails and canapes just up there, and I hope you'll all join us. The second thing is that CQ Roll Call's team on Homeland Security has produced an executive briefing, which is being gifted to everyone who's come here tonight. So I hope you take that away with you. And we have some time for questions. I'm not sure whether we have a mic.
There are mics on the aisles.
So don't be shy. Can I see a hand? There's a gentleman right there, and there's a lady right behind you with a mic.
As you went around the world and you focused on the Middle East, I was wondering if you'd take a few minutes and talk about the president's pivot towards Asia and the issue. I guess my concern is it will be based in some way on coalition, building a coalition of partners. And two of those partners make our Congress, and I'm talking South Korea and Japan, make our Congress look like a bunch of guys just going to play golf and have a couple beers afterwards. Because at least my observation, things are getting more dicey all the time between the two of them.
You know, I was just in Japan, I guess about a year ago, and almost begging some of the folks I was talking to make nice with South Korea, just saying, look, you're both our allies, we'd really like to do something with you, and can you come together? And boy, are you right. There is not a lot of love between those two countries, and the rational neo-realist way of thinking about things is not cutting a lot of water there. We didn't even touch on Asia, and it's the biggest part of the world, most people, and really quite volatile right now. I would be surprised if I get through my lifetime without a war in Asia. And so we need to get those allies working together, and I don't see it happening without a lot of massaging.
Thank you for introducing that. And Carly, let's talk about the pivot to Asia. It was a sort of late first term initiative. It's kind of gone aground. It seems to be he'll leave office with it incomplete.
Yeah. I used to be an English teacher at the high school level before I went to law school, and my favorite line from Shakespeare is, "Talkers are no good doers." Look what people do, not what they say. And I think most people, if they said there's a pivot to, you said there's a pivot to Asia in the Obama administration, they'd say, oh, there is? Oh, when did that happen? Look, you have Chinese jets circling our jets. You have the Chinese Navy expanding exponentially. You have Chinese making extraordinary extraterritorial claims in terms of their EEZ. They're building. Their economy's now slowing down, but I think the Obama administration, it may not have been a pivot, but it's been repositioning some of the pieces on the chessboard because we need to do that. But what's on the front page of the paper is ISIS, Russia, and I think that gentleman's question is further support for the argument that we'll probably see a big debate about the defense budget this spring and whether you need to lift the BCA or whether you need to refund and recapitalize from this decade of war.
And Obama's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, is giving a speech this week, I believe, on Southeast Asia in particular. The government, the United States government, maybe all governments, tend to react to what is happening right then. They don't tend to plan very long term. This was a case of, okay, we need to be prepared. But other than, say, China doing a lot of hacking, that doesn't seem to make a lot of, any sort of Asian pivot doesn't seem to be making a lot of news right now. It doesn't mean that there isn't some groundwork being laid. There was a really interesting small provision in one of the defense bills that was saying we need to reestablish jungle combat training. Because we used to have a dedicated base in Panama, and we don't have it anymore. And the thinking is we're going to be in some kind of war at some point with some Asian nation. Let's start being prepared just in case.
Jerry, what happened to the pivot to Asia? It seemed like it was an attempt to have an Obama doctrine, a new chapter, new way of thinking, and a counterpoint to China's influence throughout, particularly in the third world. What happened?
Well, first of all, I think the term pivot was probably unfortunate, and everybody involved in the policy will agree on that. It implied we're not going to do this because we're now going to do that. And what it really was supposed to be, and I think there is some of this actually happening, it means slowly shifting resources to a part of the world that becomes relatively more important while other parts of the world become relatively less important. So I think to some extent the pivot, call it something different, is still happening. One of the premises, though, was, and this is clearly where the idea falls down, was that as we end two wars in the Middle East, we can stop paying so much attention there and start paying more attention here. As a nation, not just as policymakers, people can shift their thinking and their arguing and the national security debate. What happened there is what we've been talking about for an hour and 15 or 20 minutes, whatever it is.
Right. I saw another hand or two up there. The lady right there, there's a man coming up behind you with a mic.
In last Wednesday's New York Times, Tom Friedman's column talked about an existential struggle that was going on within the Islamic State, and that helped to explain some of the recent events we've seen in the Middle East. He said that was an attempt among them to try to define their future. I'd welcome any comments on that, or if anyone did read it, your thoughts on the general column itself.
Well, I've spent more time than is probably healthy reading Islamic State literature over the last few weeks. So, but it's really fascinating, and it's actually quite sophisticated. And there is a I'm not sure debate is the right word. There's a very vigorous conversation going on within the people who are part of the movement about what they mean and why they're different from Al-Qaeda in particular. And now they don't mention Al-Qaeda all the time, but there is a notion that they have embraced as a group that says essentially, well, Al-Qaeda was wrong. They thought that by attacking the West, over time you would wear down the opponents of Islam, and then you would create the conditions slowly to have a caliphate. And the Islamic State people have blown right past all that, saying, here, it's now, you do the right thing, and you stop the people who disagree with you. I think that as the Islamic State movement grows, there are bound to be people who have different thoughts about, at least on tactical terms, well, are we going too fast? Are we going too far? Haven't we stuck our heads up too high above, out of the foxhole? We're going to get whacked. And I can't imagine there's not an interesting debate going on about whether beheading videos, to go back to where we started, was that a really good strategic move on their part? So it's hard to know, but I guess my point is, there's a really interesting public window into Islamic State if you just go look at what they say themselves, and it does reveal a lot.
And I would add, this is not a new phenomenon. If you read Andy McCarthy's book, The Grand Jihad, he traces not only the birth of the predecessors of Al-Qaeda, but the two general schools of Islamicists. One is those who adhere to some form of violent jihad. ISIS is obviously the most recent and radical version of that. The other is a version that says, no, you don't, we forswear that. You go this route, you get more mosques, you set up a currency exchange program, you send students into various universities. We do it through other lawful means. And the two are at each other's throats, figuratively speaking. And so I think Friedman's piece was really what's going on within a fraction of this side of the debate.
And as Clay was saying, actually, you can broaden this even bigger. If you look back at Qutb's writings back in the 1950s, when the whole movement really got going, it was an effect of modernity. What was modernity doing to the Middle East? Why were they not catching up? Why were they so clearly behind the West? How do they deal with that sense of humiliation and lack of agency that he was feeling, and that he came up with all sorts of reasons? But one way that the Arab world was dealing with that, with what was known as the Arab Spring, was actually a quite healthy move, in my view, toward taking agency and saying, okay, you have your violent folks over here, Al-Qaeda, they tried to regain the ball and move forward. They failed. We're going to do this through peaceful democratic means. And I think one of the real pities that that movement in most countries didn't succeed, that we and others perhaps didn't do quite enough, but really it was an internal issue in terms of how much they could succeed on their own. One of the real pities is that now we're back in a world of sort of hardcore Islam and less hardcore Islam, rather than another way forward for how do you deal with that sense of humiliation.
I think I saw another.
We've actually got a question that just came in from Twitter, and it's a great one. It
Okay.
didn't come in at all on the panel. Sorry to introduce myself.
Okay.
I'm John Reed with Just Security. But it was, will veterans issues play into the midterms?
That's another one that they've tried to play up on the Republican side as a competence question. I mean, veterans are very politically popular for very obvious reasons. They should be popular, and but you haven't seen a whole lot of pressure from the Republican side on that, other than another example of how this administration is bad at leading generally.
It's a hard issue, I would say. I mean, North Carolina, it's come up a little bit in Kay Hagan's race. But in general, first of all, if you look at the actual votes, the Democrats have voted a lot of money for veterans and so on. The Republicans have not backed those votes. On the other hand, you have the VA scandal, so it kind of points in a lot of different directions. In general, a lot's been done for veterans. So saying that someone's not good on veterans, other than the veterans scandal, which is a scandal and a horrible thing, is a hard thing to argue. So I doubt it'll make a huge dent in races. Now, you do have a couple of races where you've got veterans running.
Yeah.
Seth Moulton just won an upset primary, and so you've got him and a number of others. And in those, I'm sure they'll use it as a character issue. I'm not sure it'll be a policy issue.
Yeah, I don't think that was specifically out of the VA scandal. It's just
Yeah, exactly.
the political power of being a veteran. But thank you to the person on Twitter who sent that in. I used to cover business, so I would say the market has priced that in, the VA scandal in this particular election. I think we have time for one more question, and I saw one more hand, or two more hands. There's a gentleman with a hand up. There's a lady with a hand up right there. Okay. We'll take these two questions, you and the next person.
Sure. So I'm curious, there's another area that we haven't talked about, which is West Africa. And there's been sort of talk about whether Ebola basically is going to be such a destabilizing influence that there will be real national security concerns coming out of kind of the collapse of states there. I realize this may not be as much a midterm issue per se, but I'm curious if people have thoughts about what the long term might look like in terms of national security issues coming from that.
It's an issue in one race already. Mark Pryor's Senate race, he had an ad where he criticized his opponent's vote on the issue of, I think it was healthcare, bio defenses, I think it was what the vote was on. And he had an ad that got very much criticized, actually. It seemed to kind of backfire. That's one issue where it's come up.
I mean, I think it goes back to Cully's point about the budget, because I think this is going to be an area where there's not going to be any strong push for concrete substantive policy, but there's going to be a need for money, especially if the U.S. decides to actually invest more resources in trying to help stabilize the regimes in Liberia and West Africa. And so I think this all goes back to the question of where is all the money going to come from to handle all of these crises at once. And so I think, I think it'll be part of that conversation, but I'm not sure it's going to take it over quite to the same extent as the other issues.
Yeah, and I think that some people, some ill-informed people, may try to use it as a wedge or an issue in the race by saying, Obama's sending more people to Africa to fight Ebola than he is to Iraq. And that's silly, and it's silly for the simple fact that, if this dread disease is not addressed by civil society, and it spreads, it has a factor of magnitude for destabilizing all sorts of, not only that part of Africa, but the world. People forget their history. It was military members who spread diseases in the past, which killed tens of millions of people. And so that hopefully won't happen today. So I think the administration is well within their legal right and their moral right to lend a hand and take a lead role in this.
I agree that it's not going to be a political issue. I was in West Africa in the fall, and I think last winter, and I think this is going to be, it's treated as a issue of medical need. This is a governance issue. Why are people not letting medical officers take their sick? Because they don't trust their governments. Why don't they trust their governments? For some pretty good reasons. Getting serious about, and I work on governance, but getting serious about how we help these governments is important, because this is what bad governance gets you. It gets people who don't trust their governments start insurgencies, don't let their sick be taken by healthcare workers, and et cetera, et cetera. And we're starting to see those problems metastasize. The difference between ISIL and Ebola is less than you might otherwise think.
Final question to that gentleman there.
Hi, John Donnelly with CQ Roll Call. I'd like to go back to Iran real quick. And if the current negotiations fail, you talked about the inevitability of sanctions, which I think is accurate. What about the inevitability of war? I would think that patience with negotiations is kind of wearing out. What are the odds that Israel and or the United States launches an attack on Iran?
That's a heavy question. Thanks, John. No, there's a sort of constant agitation for war with Iran in various quarters, often more on the Republican side, but not entirely. This is a pretty big gambit that the president has made here. He's acknowledged up front that it's a pretty big gambit, and he's put a lot of energy into it. Now, maybe he can mitigate. Maybe what he's been doing all along is mitigating the fear of war by talking about just how difficult a deal will be. It would be hard. There is actually a next level of punishing sanctions that is worse than what we've done. So we can go harder on sanctions. We can go pretty hard on sanctions. But yeah, I think you'll see more agitation. We've been talking about the Iran nuclear program for decades now, and how worried we are, and how we might need to attack. More agitation, yes. Whether it goes to that next level, it's hard to imagine for me right now.
There's also, there's a legacy question here. I read one of the sort of odder stories I saw this week was that the finalists had been chosen for President Obama's presidential library site. You're well into a second term when it's library site time. And it strikes me that this is a president who came to office with 2 wars, both of which one of which he was steadfastly opposed to, the other of which he was dedicated to ending on the swiftest terms possible. I think it's now probably clear to him that he's not going to be able to end both of them, that we're not going to be totally out of Afghanistan and Iraq when he leaves office. But I think he sure as heck doesn't want to have a 3rd war. Right? He doesn't want the number to go up by the time he leaves on January 20th, 2017. And so, I think Tim's right. I think anything this administration can do to avoid new conflicts while trying to do whatever they can to even declare victory in one conflict, if that means pulling combat troops out of Afghanistan and saying, all right, we're done, hold your breath that nothing else happens once they're gone.
And they've boxed themselves in a little bit because they promised that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. It might be hard for us to ever know whether when the moment arrives that Iran has a nuclear weapon. But to give themselves some more room to negotiate, they've been very bellicose and they've been very harsh in their description of how we're not going to let Iran have a nuclear weapon at any cost, which of course implies the threat of force.
Of course,
so
we also promised to close Guantanamo.
Sure, yes. So yes, government doesn't always keep their promises. You're right.
So, Jerry, punishing sanctions more likely?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, first of all, you're right, absolutely right, that there's no appetite within this administration, and won't be, for a military conflict with Iran. The question of how much pressure there is exerted from outside forces, from Congress, from Israel, from others, depends, I think, a lot on how negotiations conclude unsuccessfully. There are various ways that could happen. They could end with a bang, they could end with a whimper, they could end with the notion that we got really close, we're not going to extend them, but if not for the crazy Ayatollah who's the supreme leader, we would have gotten there. Maybe we should just wait and see if he dies off sometime soon. There are a lot of different scenarios, and I think the amount of pressure to do something militarily will depend a great deal on what that end game looks like.
There's also, I think, a lot of understanding that a military solution doesn't end the problem. The Pentagon calls it the mow the lawn strategy. You mow the lawn, the grass grows again, you mow the lawn again. And they recognize that a bombing campaign, the boots on the ground solution for Iran is unthinkable. A bombing campaign only gets you so far. And so why start down that road, particularly 6 years into an administration?
You agree,
Colin? Yeah, I agree with everybody. And I would add that if there was any action whatsoever, it wouldn't be us, it would be Israel. And we would do everything we could behind the scenes to encourage them not to do that. But of course, they're a sovereign state, and they're going to act in their own self-defense in the way they think they have to. And their leadership has made that clear. But I agree with everybody here. I don't think there's any appetite. And I think you also see the evolving definition of what sanctions are. Because they'll go up, they'll go a little to the side, they'll keep going this way, but we'll keep ratcheting pressure, whatever you want to call it, because there's no appetite for a war against Iran, and it would not be a good thing to be in.
And if the politics of our national security are complicated enough, the politics of our representatives and senators when it comes to Israel is a whole different matter altogether.
Right. Well, on that tentatively peaceful note, I'd like to once again congratulate Just Security on its first anniversary. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us for cocktails in a few moments. I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. My name is David Ellis from CQ Roll Call, and I'd like you to join me in thanking my guests, Cully Stimson, Rachel Kleinfeld, Steve Loddick, Jerry Seib, and Tim Starks. Thank you.
Fun.